So, hello everybody, and welcome to this special episode where we're going to be talking about vestigial traits in animals and humans. So, if you don't know what vestigial traits are, they're basically like what you could think of as evolution's leftovers. So, as animals or plants change throughout time, sometimes they've developed a structure or an organ that they don't need anymore after after like that species or what have you has changed. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But with me here to help with that is my friend Ian McLaughlin, Dr. Ian McLaughlin, who is a neuroscientist. And so he's going to help me with some of the human examples.
Hey,
Hey,
everybody.
Ian,
Yeah, I'm Ian
welcome.
McLaughlin. Yeah, thank you. Hey, Scott. Thanks for hopping in, man. So I have a PhD in neuroscience, and my research focused on basically a really evolutionarily ancient part of the brain that's like right in the middle, right, like in the core of the brain that regulates basically the relationship between your emotion and your outward behavior. It's called the medial labenula interbronchial nucleus, and it's one of those brain regions that's been on Earth in an animal of some sort for at least 350 million years, and it's very not vestigial. The vestigial traits have always been this kind of concept in biology that's been kind of interesting to me because it is one of the most sort of like clear demonstrations of evolution. Looking forward to getting into it.
Yeah, and so my research focuses on bats. For those of you who don't know me, I'm working on my PhD at University of Michigan. So I would be totally remiss if I didn't start this episode with a bat example. So to get us really started though here, for those of you who don't know, like the structure that makes up the human hand in other animals has developed into all sorts of other different structures. So our hand is evolutionary, has evolution from an evolutionary sense, has like a common root with like the paw of a cat, or also the fin of a whale, or even the wing of a bat. So the bones that make up our fingers, for example, in a bat's wing have extended and now form the support structure for their wing. So if we think about like the ancestor of a bat was this little animal, marsupial-like thing, that pre-marsupial even like thing, that crawled around eating insects. This picture is a little bit weird because it looks like the insect is just gonna like crawl into its mouth of its own volition. But this is like the pre-flying ancestor of the bat. Oh, thank you so much, Christian and David Howden for the awards. But after we get past that stage, the idea is that, okay, the ancestor of bats was this little thing crawling around. Then later, it was this animal that glided. It didn't have powered flight, it didn't have wings, but it had skin stretched out between its feet so that it could glide. In fact, I think my sweater, I can even like do this kind of with my sweater. It's like this. Like it just has like extra skin. But eventually, we get a little bit more refined in our evolutionary design, and we have a bat, which has powered flight. And it has this very thin wing membrane, still supported by its long finger bones, but it can flap and power its flight. And so bats now, they have, let's look at this, let me pull up this other picture where I've sort of highlighted the different digits of the bat. So if you look at those, circles in the front of its wing on this picture, you can see, this picture, you can see that with the circles in front, those are where the bat's thumbs are because its wings are like this, and its thumbs still have claws on them. But all of its other fingers, which are sort of hanging out in the back part of the wing, there's no more claws that are left there. But what's interesting is if we look at a fossil, an ancient fossil of a bat, we can see that bats used to have a lot more claws. So this is a fossil called, the species is called Onychonycteris finii. And this is a bat that no longer exists, but we have this beautiful fossil where we can actually see claws at the tips of all of its appendages. So in this picture, all of those little circles are the ends of bat fingers that still have claws attached, which is pretty cool. So none of our modern bats have claws anymore, but this ancient bat did. And we can see it a little bit better in this artistic rendering where we have a bat flying that has claws on its thumbs, on the front of its wings, but also on all of its other fingers. And so basically that happened because the evolutionary ancestor, that little animal that was crawling around on all fours, eating insects, it had claws at the bottom of all of its fingers. And those claws were useful because they helped it to grab onto things. And as it developed into this animal that had powered flight, it kind of had this evolutionary leftover thing where it still had the claws for all of its fingers, even though it didn't need them anymore. So yeah, it's pretty cool because we can see how like vestigial traits work over time. We see that there's this trait that hung out and was still around, and then it wasn't needed anymore, and so eventually it disappeared. But bats kept their thumb claws because their thumb claws are actually still useful to them. So if we look at like another picture of a modern bat here, we can see that it's using that one little claw on its thumb in the top left of the picture. It's using the one claw on its thumb to like hold on to this piece of rock as it's climbing around in the cave. So like basically the takeaway from this for the audience members here is that, you know, vestigial traits might disappear with time, but because evolution is so slow, it takes a long time for the species to kind of become optimized to its new environment and surroundings. And so we see these in between phases where we might have, for example, a bat with lots of claws. But Ian knows about a lot of these examples in people. So Ian, I'm curious, what are some instances of this happening with people that you can share with us?
Yeah, so there are a bunch of examples of vestigial traits in humans, and I have a couple examples, but I'm thinking maybe we'll sort of explore one of them in greater depth because it sort of bridges the gap between, or it sort of demonstrates the relationship that we have with other animals, with whom we share a less common ancestor. But so one of them is called the vomeronasal organ. Okay, it's also sometimes called Jacobson's organ, particularly when talking about snakes. But it is an organ that basically any animal you can think of has, and it's basically part of our olfactory system, you know, our sense of smell. And so just as an example, if you have a cat, you could right now see its vomeronasal organ. Sorry, I'm trying to find my picture of it so you can see it, and it is right here. Okay, sorry everybody. We have a lot of pictures, so we're yeah. Here we go. All right, so maybe we can do that. Whatever. Okay. So you can see, you know, I put that little yellow arrow there pointing to I know it's probably a little bit small, but there's this like little sort of nubbin at the roof of the cat's mouth, right? It's like a knobby thing, and like that's where
it's just like in the center behind the teeth. Okay.
Right. It's like a little knob sort of at the end of that ridge, right? And so that's where its vomeronasal organ is. And, you know, as a part of the olfactory system, it basically responds to specific molecules that are just floating through the air. And those molecules can change these animals' behavior or, you know, inner states. And so, you know, the description I gave is basically identical to how the broader olfactory system works, like the one that we have. We have receptors in our olfactory system that end up binding specific molecules that are floating around in the air, and depending upon which of those receptors are bound at any one time, we can experience the smell of roses or a citrusy smell of an orange, or importantly, you know, the smell of something that might be decomposing or rotting, right? That's vile to us. It's disgusting. And so, you know, that's one of the fundamental roles of our olfactory system, which is a very unique sensory system, by the way, when it comes to like our sensory systems like vision and our auditory system, our ability to hear things, distinguishing between foods that are safe or nutritious or, you know, good for us, and foods that are dangerous because of stuff like bacteria growing on it, that's a really important role that pretty much only our olfactory system can really do for us. But so that's the sort of basic fundamental function of our olfactory system. There's obviously quite a bit more to our sense of smell than just, is this thing going to be yummy or is it going to kill me, right? We associate things like what our home smells like, right? Or what our favorite restaurant might smell like, or, what our significant other might smell like, or as the dad of a tiny little human, let me tell you that smelling the baby's head is a thing I do completely reflexively, and she smells awesome. And I'm sure she only really smells awesome to me and, her other and her mother. But all of that complexity is conveyed through our sense of smell, right? It's not purely identifying certain molecules or categorizing molecules. It has a more substantial effect on our consciousness, right? And so, while we are genetically very similar to other primates like chimpanzees and bonobos, their olfactory system is even more influential for them, right, in terms of like their interstates, their consciousness than ours is to us. And so, while we do technically have a vomeronasal organ, just like your pet cat does, theirs is far more functionally relevant than ours. Theirs has receptors that bind, specific molecules again, right, just like the broader olfactory system. But the specific receptors associated with the vomeronasal organ bind a certain category of molecules that convey different characteristics about particularly the other animals around them, and particularly other animals of their own species. And so, you might have all heard of pheromones, right? Which are, molecules that essentially all animals secrete that are sort of like indicators of their and our inner biological states, right? And other animals are definitely more potently influenced by pheromones, particularly when it comes to reproductive behavior. But it can also convey an animal's emotional state, right? Like fear, for example. There are certain molecules that animals will secrete when they're feeling fear. And this is like, even fish do this. And so the vomeronasal organ is the sort of ground zero for when it comes to processing all of those chemical cues, right? It's sort of like a nonverbal language. And some animals even have like a specific maneuver that they do more effectively to get those molecules to their vomeronasal organ, sort of like how they might move their ears to hear specific things. More on that later, by the way. That's another vestigial trait that we have. But anyways, yeah,
is that like when cats make that weird face, like when they're trying to smell? Mm-hmm. Does that have to do with getting?
That's exactly the maneuver. Yeah. It's like sort of like they sort of wrinkle up a little bit. That's like, I don't know if there's like a name for that move. But
there is. I can't remember it now. I want to look it up. I know that like the picture that they often use of lions looking really angry, for example, like it looks like the lion is roaring or something, and they're like, Argh! It's really them like trying to get air into their nose, I guess to their vomeronasal organ to smell better or something like that. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. It's pretty cool, right? And so, when it comes to the vomeronasal organ in humans, it's definitely a controversial topic. We know that the same types of cells that ultimately generate the organ in other animals also arise during human embryonic development. So the basis is there. And that's not surprising. We are, after all, pretty genetically related to those other animals, particularly chimpanzees, right? But the most common argument that I've heard is that when it comes to the human biology, right, human vomeronasal organ, we sort of have it. But it's like a shriveled, barely functional version of an organ that's significantly more active in other animals. And, sort of like our pinky toe compared to the pinky toe of a chimpanzee, right? And in case you've never seen the foot of a chimpanzee, it is bananas. It is wild. Here, check. So that's the foot of a chimp. I mean, look at their pinky. It looks like a finger. It looks like my actual pinky, right? And then compare that to, our pinky toes that are just sort of like, shriveled, pointless little stubs, right? And so that's sort of like, the equivalent of our vomeronasal organ. It's there technically, but you wouldn't miss it if it wasn't, right? And then also another line of evidence to suggest that it is essentially vestigial is when scientists have explored the genes that are active in, the human equivalent of the vomeronasal organ, most of those genes are what we call pseudogenes, right? So versions of genes that over evolutionary time underwent changes that basically made them non-functional, right? Now, all that said, it is definitely controversial. There are some studies that suggest that humans do respond to pheromone-like molecules. And I'll end on this example because it's just a classic example that I think is really fun. There was a famous study or series of studies conducted by a scientist named Klaus Wedekind, right, using T-shirts that guys wore to go to sleep overnight for 2 days. So his results suggested that heterosexual women tended to prefer the odors on T-shirts of males who had basically the equivalent of immune systems that were rather different from their own, right? So they would, you could predict which shirt a heterosexual woman would prefer by knowing the genetics of a dude's immune system, right? And so there's an interesting whole sort of possible explanation, interpretation for why that might be the case in humans. And the argument was, okay, there's some evidence for, if not pheromone specifically, the type of, vomeronasal reactions that other animals have where they'll prefer certain other members of their species. They can detect fear, they can detect aggression. But I think it's safe to say that the consensus in neuroscience is that, while we may have something like a vomeronasal organ, the equivalent of like the pinky of a vomeronasal organ, it is like the pinky toe version and it's largely inconsequential. So vestigial. All right, that's my first example. I'll stop there.
That's a great example. Can I ask, you might have said it and then I might have missed it, but like what's the reasoning for like why humans would not need that ability as much?
So, I mean, and I know that you're very familiar with these examples, particularly since you work more in evolution than I did. But there is no like great explanation. I mean, I say it's controversial. Like there are definitely neuroscientists, respected neuroscientists, who are far more bullish on humans being driven more by olfaction than the sort of accepted wisdom would suggest. And so, they would suggest it's not shriveled. Like it is functioning the way it evolved. It didn't shrivel. It's just, that's how it's always been in our branch, when we branched off from Pan, right, from chimps and bonobos and stuff. But the other argument would be we have, better, more effective sensory systems that will, signal the types of things that the vomeronasal organ would handle in more primitive organisms, right, that don't have really excellent vision, that, don't have higher cognitive function, that can, I can see that certain features of this other group of the tribe and, whatever. And let's just take American society, like, long hair, whatever, certain like secondary sexual characteristics. And so we don't really need to like smell, to have a sense of whether or not you find this person attractive, right? That's what I would imagine would be the kind of standard.
I'm seeing like a few different examples. And I mean, this gets at the idea of why vestigial organs are expected to disappear eventually, because there's a cost to having them, right? It takes some energy to produce them, like developmentally when you're forming in the womb or whatever, and to maintain them potentially. So if humans have other ways of getting this information, like talking to somebody, that work better, then like you would expect that thing would just kind of like eventually disappear. It will take longer to disappear than something that's evolutionary disadvantageous, that's like actively, like individuals with that characteristic are like actively getting killed or something like that. It's like,
or they can't reproduce as much.
That trait is going to disappear quickly. But with vestigial organs, it seems like they often hang out for a while because it's not necessarily bad to have them. They're relatively
it's not bad enough to prevent them from reproducing, right? So, it's not super expensive. It doesn't really interfere with their ability to reproduce. It's not like it's sexually gross to whomever they want to reproduce with. But yeah, so James brings up the appendix. That is a great example where we can explore that debate, because the appendix can be a pretty problematic part of the body, and it potentially can be a valuable part of the body. More recent evidence suggests, but we'll talk about the appendix later.
Yeah, and I mean, it's super exciting. Like the thing is, because vestigial organs have hung on for so long, it's actually like, humans have an appendix, but also like rabbits have one. Like a lot of different mammals have an appendix of varying degrees and sizes. And so you can sometimes look like across the evolutionary tree of life and see like, oh, humans maybe don't use theirs very much. Rabbits have something like it that's very important. And so you can see it because like it takes so long to disappear. Like sister species and like all these related groups of species will still have something that's useful or not useful to varying degrees, and that can help us get at the different questions about like why is this thing still here, or what did it used to do. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I do have another example.
Yeah.
If you're game,
Yeah,
yeah.
I was
Okay.
just gonna get at another. I was gonna say like, yeah, you have, what other examples do you have for us, Ian?
I have a bunch, so you're gonna have to stop me at a certain point. But
Okay.
one of my favorite examples of a human vestigial trait are goosebumps. And so this is like an example of our or goose pimples. I think some folks call them, particularly in the UK, or goose skin. It's another example of like the footprint of our evolutionary ancestors in our biology, right? And so, here I'll give you. It's actually a really interesting mechanism that enables it to happen. Okay, so but it's sort of ridiculous, right? It's kind of ridiculous, that we'd have all these tiny little muscles. So that's what you're seeing on the top there. See that little red thing that's sort of like oscillating? That's a muscle that's adjacent to each hair follicle. And that's its entire purpose, is to do exactly what you're saying, right? That we, and it's just ridiculous that we'd have all these. Think about how many muscles that equates to. Itsy bitsy little hairs along our body, hairs that you can barely even see to begin with, right? And the entire function of them is just to make those little hairs stand up. It's kind of ridiculous. And so I haven't seen a particularly convincing explanation for some like actual useful function of goosebumps in humans. I think if we were really stretching our imaginations, I could imagine that there could theoretically be a social function, like where if I see someone experiencing goosebumps, I sort of have an inside look into the nature of their inner emotional sensory experience in a way that they can't control, right? So it's sort of like another mechanism by which humans can communicate with one another. I don't really buy that, to be honest.
I
think
like this idea where like you're like there's danger, and then you have goosebumps, and then the hair standing on end like allows you to feel like the air movements of someone coming up behind you, and you're like, I gotcha.
That's interesting. That's an interesting one. I'm a little bit more convinced by that. But then, so if you think about our primate ancestors, right, our much hairier ancestors, right? It's a holdover from them, and so we basically get goosebumps under pretty much two situations, right? So the first is when we're chilly, and the second is if we're starting to experience a fight or flight reaction, right? A fearful reaction, like Georgia was bringing up, and so they're frankly pretty useless in both of those situations for us, right? Except for maybe, being sort of conversation between your autonomic and your somatic nervous systems, right? Your conscious and unconscious nervous systems, where your conscious nervous system is like, oh, I'm having goosebumps. That's because I'm afraid, like that. Yeah. That's not really a great explanation, but pretty useless, right? But, if we were still covered from head to toe with fur, all those tiny little muscles, standing up, all those hairs, all that fur, hair upward, right? It would start to have a pretty meaningful effect on a couple of things. First, on what we look like, right? As well as how much heat is trapped by that air. And so the concept is that, the reason we get goosebumps when we're either cold or we're in a fight or flight situation, survival situation, is because they happen to trap heat, more effectively, sort of like a winter coat, right? But then also would have made, our hairier ancestors ever so slightly bigger, right? Because we just, we appear to take up more space. Tons of animals do that kind of thing, particularly like certain fish will just like have these really elaborate, like lionfish, I think, right? Will have these elaborate spines that come out, and there's sort of like this threatening display. A lot of animals just try to make themselves bigger. And so that's one of the examples or the explanations for the role that it played when we were hairier, that it's now just sort of like, it just happens. We can't really stop it. And it's not super expensive, right? And it's not like, anybody's going to be like, oh, this person's gross, they have goosebumps seldomly, but it did have a functional role, an adaptive role in our evolutionary past. So that's one of the sort of fun examples. And I know watching videos of goosebumps can sometimes give people goosebumps, so I'll take those off.
Ooh, cool. I didn't know that. Yeah, David Howden, I believe, brought up another example that I think you were alluding to when we were talking before this show happened. But he brought up, am I right that the twin tendons down the wrist are vestigial claw retractors?
That's an awesome topic. I mean, yeah, okay, why don't we get into that? So you are correct that in other animals, that muscle is called the palmaris longus. And so yeah, let's just get into it. So this is an example of a vestigial structure in humans that sort of made the internet rounds a couple years ago, I think. And it is also something that not every human has, and so we can all test ourselves. It's an easy test to do right here. Oh, let me do this so you can actually see what it looks like. There we go.
And while Ian's pulling, oh, go ahead, yeah.
Okay, so what the palmaris longus is it's like really narrow, long muscle that pretty much runs along the bottom of the arm, right? Most people have it, like by far most people have it. Some people only have it in one arm. It's kind of interesting, and some people, like me, don't have it at all. And so the way you can test, you can sort of see what this person is doing here is you turn your palm to face you, obviously you see it, and you sort of tightly pinch your fingers together, sort of like I work in New Jersey, and that is like sort of the state gesture is this. But you sort of pinch your fingers together kind of tightly and see if that little thingy-mabob stands out, right?
Is it this?
Yeah, it doesn't look...
Wait, hang on. Do I have to have it facing towards me?
No, well, no, I don't think so. I just only ever done it.
I don't have it either.
I don't have it. Isn't that wild? But yeah, so my wife actually does have it. And so,
get your wife on
so
here.
pretty much every primate that you can name. She's a little camera.
I can't tell if I have it or not. I think maybe I do.
Yeah, it's kind of tough to see. Yeah, maybe that's it. Yeah, it's sort of like off to the side. Yeah, it's kind of tough to do it with your arm up like that. So.
Okay. Does it have it down? Oh, yeah, it's way more prevalent if I put my arm down. I wish I think, but it's also kind of thicker than I thought. This is like very...
It's pretty thick, yeah.
Extreme. Okay. Yeah, it's it's like this whole thing here pops up.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so pretty much every primate has that thing, who's genetically sort of similar-ish to us. Think chimpanzees and orangutans and so on, but only some of them actually actively use it. Cats have a palmaris longus, as I believe that was David that brought it up. For example, for claw retraction. If you've had a baby, you might have heard of the palmar reflex. And so this is this adorable thing that babies do. It's this sort of like simple kind of test that can be done with a newborn, where they'll pretty much grab onto anything you put in their hand. And it's pretty amusing and kind of adorable. And other infant primates do this too. And it sort of makes sense that they do it because most of them rely on, the other primates rely on the babies literally grasping onto their mother to be carried around and stuff. So the mother's hands are free. And I'm like 100% certain that my daughter wishes she could constantly grasp onto my wife and be adhered to her at all times. But, once Homo sapien ancestors started branching off in our own direction, we no longer really relied on that so much. But the muscle still develops, and most of us still have it. I think it's something like 14% of the population, and these numbers vary a bit depending upon which communities you're talking about. But about 14% of the population doesn't have it at all. And it's a larger number has just one of them. And then, something, approaching 80% of people have it. So yeah, it's a vestigial muscle. Kind of cool.
That's cool. Wait, is this, have you heard of Blaschko's lines? Someone mentions it in the comments. I might just be butchering the name. I don't know if this is considered lines. Vestigial, but I recently learned about Blaschko's lines. We don't know about that. Frank, tell us more. We are excited to hear. And a lot of people in the comments have super interesting ideas and thoughts. As mentioned that birds also use like movements of their feathers to communicate and stuff like that. Like just like the mammal hair raising on end can be useful. So lots of reasons to puff yourself up or what have you. Oh, wisdom.
I just realized.
Yeah, go ahead.
I failed to actually, in case anybody's interested of where the vomeronasal organ is. That was the first thing we talked about. It's sort of like, it's basically right
Okay.
where that cat version is. It's sort of above the roof of our mouth, behind our nose kind of situation. Yeah. Anyways, I forgot to share that.
Yeah, so
um,
it's weird to me, like we can't feel ours at all, like in our mouth, because the cat has like the bump. We don't have the bump, but
mhm.
it's still like in there. Okay,
Yeah. Yeah. That's exactly right.
interesting. Is it like much bigger proportionally in the cats, and that's why it's bumped
Yes.
out, or just like the positioning is different? Okay,
Definitely bigger.
cool.
Yeah. I'm not familiar with Blaschko's lines. Just looking it up. Yeah, like I'm aware of
Yeah.
there's like an example of certain women have a sort of interesting distribution of sweat glands, but I'm familiar with this. Thank you for bringing it up.
Yeah, we'll have to look into it.
Yeah,
Scott has an update. Neither of his cats will let him find that organ, which
yeah,
I'm,
you have to be pretty
as a
careful.
fellow cat owner, I'm not surprised by that.
Yeah,
Um,
not psyched.
yeah. Well, maybe we can switch to an animal example real quick, another animal example, because I know that we've kind of talked already a lot about how it's not necessarily clear whether something is truly vestigial or not. And maybe this will be a good segue actually for human appendix discussions. But so let's talk about whales. So for a long time, whale pelvis bones were thought to be vestigial. And this is, from like a textbook or something. Like whales clearly don't need a pelvis. The purpose of our pelvis is like our legs attached to it, and it has muscle connections and stuff and structural support that lets our legs move around and allows us to walk. But whales are actually, for those who don't know, they evolved from something like this guy, this Pachycetus, which is basically a mammal that used to be a terrestrial mammal, a mammal that would walk around on the land. But with time, um, the ancestors of the whales actually ended up going back to the water. So here's an artistic rendering based on some fossils that were found in Peru, I believe, of a more recent ancestor of the whale. And so this is after they started to transition like back to the water. So you have this animal that can walk on land. It also swims around in the water. It has webbed feet. It's eating fish. And so this explains why whales have a pelvis in the first place, basically, right? Because they needed one at one point. Their ancestors needed one so that they could like have four legs and walk around on land. But as they went back into the water, so the story goes, the pelvis became less and less useful until eventually we get to this point where they basically have some like tiny leftover pelvis bones that aren't really doing anything, except for just like, hanging out and continuing to exist. But as Ian and I have been alluding to several times now, it's not always very clear whether something is truly vestigial or not. So what happens is, zooming out, evolutionary context, a trait has developed, pelvis bones. It has a function, helping to walk around. And then as time goes on, the given species doesn't need that thing anymore. So three things can happen at this point. Either that trait can be repurposed, it can disappear with time, um, or it can just like continue to exist and be there but useless. So those are kind of the three options for vestigial traits. In the case of the whale pelvis bone, so for a long time we thought, okay, it's still here, but it's not useful. But what they found is actually the pelvis bone is repurposed, no longer not useful. So these researchers, along with some other folks, oops, I got rid of the wrong image. There was a study that came out recently where they found that this whale pelvis bone is actually useful. And what it's useful for is in mating. I guess muscles attach from the penis to the pelvis bone in whales and dolphins, and having a bigger pelvis bones actually allowed the animals to have bigger penises, or I think specifically like bigger testes, which then that's good sometimes because it means that you can make more sperm and like outcompete the sperm of other males. So basically, these guys found that having a bigger pelvis actually was evolutionarily advantageous for whales and dolphins. And this is the paper here that came out, just to give credit where credit is due. So these pelvic bones aren't vestigial. They've actually been repurposed, and they're now getting acted on by sexual selection. So this is a cool example of how, something that for a long time was the textbook example of something being vestigial is actually not vestigial. It's been repurposed, which is really cool, because evolution works with what it has, basically, and that sometimes means repurposing things in interesting ways. So yeah, let's see, David Howden. Oh, we have a couple questions. Scott says, whale ancestors were like, I've seen enough, I'm out of here. Possibly, yeah. David Howden says, in insects, some females are flightless with reduced or now wings, but males are wings. Would that count as vestigial? Ooh, so that is a really interesting question, David. And I think it's interesting because it gets a lot at the scale of what we're talking about. So usually when we think of vestigial traits, we think of something that is no longer useful like for the entire species. And we don't necessarily think of it being useful for like males versus females, because it's pretty hard to completely get rid of something for like just one sex of a species, because your genetics for that species are still like pretty similar. I suppose like you could say that it's vestigial like for the females, but it kind of gets down to semantics. It becomes more of like a definitional question than like, is this fundamentally like something that's like hanging out in long evolutionary time because it's not useful anymore. So I probably wouldn't say it's vestigial, just because I think of vestigial as something that like evolution could have gotten rid of, but it hasn't. And because the males of the male insects are still using their wings, I would say that it's still useful like for the species. Yeah, but that's an interesting question.
Sort of reminds me of the whole conversation about why men have nipples, right?
Oh yeah, that's
where
true.
They are there, and with the right exposure to molecules, you can get a male to lactate, or somebody with a Y chromosome to lactate, but they are essentially pointless in your standard XY carrying human. So Georgia, when I was looking at that image, the cartoon of the here, I'll just bring it up, the whale pelvis one.
Oh yeah.
So in their fins, I've always wondered this, and like I've never just taken the time, but are those like finger-like bones, are they considered vestigial, like the bones themselves, or do they play like an important structural, mechanical role?
Right.
Do you know?
So let me bring up the picture again of all the appendages lined up. So it was not an accident that I picked like this first picture. So if you look at the third from the left, that's like the zoomed in version of the whale fin. And so these are like the front flippers of the whales, right? And you can see like on the bottom whale picture, like they don't have in their back, like they don't have any like important back flippers coming from their back pelvis that are useful. But in the front, those fingers are still important for the structure of the fin, supposedly. Like, it's helping, their fins are like pushing against like a lot of water and stuff. And so like those long finger bones are like helping them push through the water still. Yeah. Not so different from the wings of a bat, which are on the far right in that picture. Those fingers are providing like structural support. So, I mean, in a way, this is also an example of repurposing though, right? Like humans, we use our fingers to help us like grasp things and hold on to them. But in other animals, like these fingers have been like repurposed to do different things, to help push through water, to support your wing membrane as you're flying and pushing against the air, things like that.
Right on. Yeah, it's cool to see whale skeletons.
Yeah, it is wild.
So should we get into the appendix?
Yeah, let's do the appendix.
Okay, so this is probably the most well-known vestigial part of our body, the appendix, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which basically seems to function as like a ticking time bomb that like may or may not very painfully explode randomly and require immediate surgery. But anyway, so I'm sure most people are like familiar with the appendix and where it is, but just in case you're not, here we are. So it's this silly little nubbin that sticks off, usually the lower right region of our intestines, and it's pretty small. Interestingly, certain identical twins, who are actually called mirror image identical twins, they can have their appendices on opposite sides of the body. Kind of cool, right? Mirror image twins are pretty neat. I think like Scott Kelly and Mark Kelly, the astronauts, I think that they are mirror image twins. Anyways, so the notion that the appendix is vestigial goes back quite a long way. Even good old Daddy Darwin thought that it was useless. He thought it was just a holdover from when the digestive system functioned differently in our ancestors, and that is pretty much still kind of the accepted wisdom. But I went to grad school at a time when the microbiome, which the sum total of all of the various microbes that inhabit pretty much your entire body, different parts of your body will have different microbes. You have a microbiome of your eyes, right? You have a microbiome of your armpits, of your skin in general, of your hair, and of your gut. And so I went to grad school when the microbiome was like the hottest topic in biomedical science. It still is sort of a pretty super hot topic. But anyways, as a result, that was when I first encountered the argument that the appendix is most definitely not useless. The argument from these microbiologists is that it functions as a kind of reservoir for the various microbes that colonize our gut, right?
Yeah, and Ian,
and so,
can I interject here real quick, because I just
please.
added this image. So like in other animals that have an appendix, it's actually called a cecum.
Yeah.
And so this picture of like a rabbit digestive tract, you can see on the sort of bottom right, there's like this big wormy sausage thing coming out. It's called the cecum. That's the rabbit's appendix, basically. And so the appendix is much bigger in some other animals, but in animals like rabbits, we certainly know that it functions exactly like Ian is saying. This is an important spot along the digestive tract. That's like, it's almost like a little like terrarium or vivarium or something, where the rabbit kind of houses like all of these special microbes. And the rabbit will divert like some of the food from its digestive tract into the cecum. And it kind of, those bacteria and microbes that are living there do like extra digestion stuff. Rabbits are eating a lot of grass and materials that are very difficult to break down from a digestive standpoint. So some of that material gets shuttled off into the cecum, and like extra digestion happens, and then it gets pooped out. And what's interesting is like the poop from the cecum that the rabbit has is like a special poop. Like it looks different from their regular poop. It's like this like green, extra green poop. And the rabbits will actually eat that again, because there's like stuff in there they can get. If they send it back through their stomach, it can get like redigested and they can get more nutrients from it and stuff. So they're like, oh, this has been broken down a bit more, and now if I like eat it again, I can get more nutrients from it. So in other mammals, in other animals that are related to humans, like rabbits, this is kind of what's happening with their appendix, with their cecum. And so then people, I think, started thinking, like Ian says, people are paying attention more to microbes and able to understand and study them better. So then people started thinking, aha, like maybe the appendix is not so useless after all in humans. So yeah, Ian, sorry to interrupt, but tell us more about that.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. Yeah, so it can sort of function as a kind of hard drive, right, or a hard drive backup of our whole, of our microbiome, right? And then they can recolonize the gut if we're exposed to a pathogen that causes, diarrhea, or in more modern times, if you're exposed to an antibiotic, because again, you're exposed to some kind of infection by a bacterium. But then, so similar to that concept of the sort of like the hard drive backup of your gut microbiome, is that, because we have all these little lovely microbes hanging out in that little nubbin, it's also a site where our immune system is sort of like constantly going to school, right? It's constantly training B cells, T cells, special kinds that are specifically in our gut that are, essentially constantly being trained in case we're exposed to some potential pathogen. And it's game time for the immune system, right? All of a sudden, they're right there. They're ready to go, right? And so, That said, right, as important as we're saying the appendix is in humans, people are completely fine without it. So it's like not super critical or anything like that. But one of the more interesting explanations for how the appendix came to take on its current role is that it may have had a completely different role in our ancestors, right? Like not even like what Georgia was describing with the cecum in some
You mean
other
farther
mammals.
back even?
Farther, yes, right. Yeah. So more of like a traditional digestive role, right? And like the rest of your gut, it also happened to be colonized by microbes, but that wasn't really its primary function. And so, as our digestive systems evolved and our bodies evolved, it became sort of superfluous. But all of a sudden, that microbiome function became its primary function, right? Repurposing other structures in our body. And so, in other words, it's like a lot of parts of our bodies, right? It may be a part of the body that had some role in the past, and then ultimately evolved to take on a new role over time. It evolved.
Yeah, that's really cool. So you're saying that it used to be used more for digestion in the sense of like that food, that like nutrients would actually be getting like extracted through there like they are in your intestines or something like that. Okay.
Yeah, cool. that it had like some sort of unique musculature that would interact with whatever you've eaten in a unique way, right? Just like we have a large intestine and a small intestine, they're very, very similar, but they do different things, right? Like the large intestine is much more devoted to extracting water from our digesting food than the small intestine, and so then if you can have two different kinds of intestines, how about three, right? But then over time it just wasn't really useful, right? And so you could just preserve resources by just not growing this giant hose, right? And then bada bing, bada boom, you got a microbe reservoir in your gut.
Cool.
So I mean, I have other examples if you're interested. Okay.
Yeah, so I'm definitely interested. And one of the things that I think is so cool about going through these human examples is that relative to other animals, like humans are very well studied. Like we know more about humans than any other animal. But even in humans, it's not clear if these traits are actually vestigial or not oftentimes. And so I think that's so cool because it highlights like how much there is for us as biologists to still learn about the world and like how bodies work and like what's actually going on at this like functional level. Yeah. So what other examples do you have for us, Ian?
So I'm trying to see. I thought I had one more. Here we go. Sweet. Oh, right. Let's get rid of this puppy. Oh, I have to do that. Sorry, everybody. This is a little awkward.
You're totally fine. I just real quick want to say thank you so much to David Dunn and David Howden and Christian Sase for the awards. We really appreciate it. It's really encouraging to get stuff like that. And some of the comments here are pretty interesting. Well, Scott says to ask about or to talk about how appendicitis isn't a thing in undeveloped countries. Is that true? Or do you know?
Yeah, I've heard that. I could get myself to believe that, but I also suspect that there's not necessarily a huge difference.
Maybe
it's
like
more
a difference in reporting or something like that.
In reporting, but then also a difference in other biomedical conditions that that sort of dominate, that become a problem earlier on, in other words. And so appendicitis doesn't really, you don't have enough time really to get to the point where you develop appendicitis. But I mean, you could be right. I have not seen that epidemiology. But yeah, so the way I could get myself to believe that that's true is just the very, very, materially different compositions of our diets, right? Where in the United States and also, a lot of the world, not just the United States, it's like hyper processed foods. That's like a category now where it's not just processed food, it's like super duper processed foods, devoid of things like fiber, if you're drinking a lot of juice, soda, etc., right? Just like this selected and enriched specific molecules that taste really, really, really good, devoid of all of the sort of vegetal context in which it's delivered, right? So you're not getting that healthy fiber, you're not getting those other vitamins and nutrients and so on. And then also we are fortunate to live in a very hygienic situation, right? Where everybody is pretty clean, particularly these days, constantly washing their hands. And that's not necessarily a luxury that's available to everybody in the world. And so as a result, their immune systems may be just sort of like more regularly exposed to a wider variety of pathogens, and which is just, that's good for the immune system. But I think that my first reaction is what I am going to go with, that it's just more like, for example, Alzheimer's disease, dementia, to suggest that it's like not an issue in developing nations, it's sort of missing the point, right? It's that, this is an age-associated condition, and we're fortunate to live pretty long time, relative to other parts of the world. Although, I'm working on this project, it has nothing to do with this, but there's a 13-mile area in New Jersey, right? One town called Princeton, where the university is, and another town called Trenton, which is the capital of the state. Those 13, and there's different zip codes, right? Obviously. And so depending upon which zip code in which you live, 13 miles away, there is a over 14-year difference in life expectancy. So you can predict that somebody is going to die 14 years earlier, on average, if they live on this side of 13 miles or on that side of 13 miles. It's kind of bananas. A lot of inequities when it comes to health. But anyway, so yeah, let's go to this other one. So this is kind of a fun one. And I have a fun video for it.
The dog.
So dogs do that with their ears. Isn't that lovely? I love it when dogs do that. And so this is another thing that humans have that are essentially pointless. And there are these tiny little muscles that enable our ears to wiggle, right? Auricular muscles is what they're called, this category. It's a collection of muscles. And I remember when I was a kid trying to figure, go ahead.
Yeah, you're trying to figure it out. Can all people wiggle their ears if they like train themselves enough? Because I can't do it.
Yeah. All people have the musculature to do it. So it's not like, the palmaris longus, where some people just don't even have the muscle at all. Everybody has those muscles. But yeah, it's just a matter of like, because we just don't use them. It's just a matter of, having to train yourself. I remember sitting and like trying to figure it out, because I think my dad could do it. And it was like very obvious that like he could do it really intensely. And I ultimately did figure it out. And it's kind of crazy when you think about it, right? We can sort of make our entire scalp move. It's kind of bananas, right? And so yeah, these are our auricular muscles. And in animals who have more sort of prodigious ear situations, being able to move your ears this way or that can help to capture sound more effectively, right? Like satellite dishes. Puppies do that, dogs do that. Some bloodhounds, I've read speculation that they also actually use their big old ears to help direct more olfactory molecules to their like magnificent noses, right? Just sort of like satellite dish again, right? I'm not sure how widely accepted that explanation is, but in humans, we can barely move our ears as it is. Our ears aren't really all that big relative to like a dog, right? And so, once again, I could imagine that, the ability to move our ears or these muscles are not entirely vestigial, where, it's as an emotion chauvinist in neuroscience, I think emotion is more important than most people intuitively think. But I could make the whole argument that like, since our ears tend to wiggle in specific emotional states, right? Like if we're fearful, if we're surprised, then, the whole argument that like, it's kind of a subtle broadcast to individuals around us that we're having a significant emotional moment, right? Which is just one of those things that might have been a helpful venue for communication, subtle communication among our ancestors before language or more elaborate mechanisms of communication were developed. We're hypersensitive to the, facial expressions and changes in facial expressions, and particularly eyes. And so theoretically, I could imagine that seeing somebody's ears and scalp move back is sort of like part of this person's scared, right? So I should probably be scared too, right?
I see.
But
wait,
in
Ian,
my mind,
I have two burning questions. I have to interrupt you.
Okay.
One, were you ever successful in getting your ears to move? And two,
Yeah.
Tell us more what you mean by oh, you were? Can you do it for us?
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but here, wait. Now I'm all on the spot here. Can you see? You probably can't see it. The camera, I don't think
I can't see it. It's too slight. Okay, so definitely not useful anymore. Second question, tell us more what you mean by you're an emotional chauvinist, and can we explore more of that idea of like, are emotions like vestigial or not? I feel like you're just like glossing over this because you're very familiar with it, but
yeah. So I mean, so as I said, right, I studied a evolutionarily very, very conserved, very ancient circuit in the brain that is sort of like a junction of all of the signaling in the frontal regions of our brain, very, very important in the human brain, a junction of signaling of all of those brain regions that then converge on this specific circuit, and then that circuit then distributes a bunch of signals throughout the rest of the brain, right? So it's sort of like, and among the various parts of our consciousness that this circuit regulates is emotion. And so I say I'm an emotional chauvinist because I think most people, when they think of the human brain and human consciousness, they tend to focus on our cognition, right? Our executive function, the things that are quintessentially human, that are uniquely human, for a good reason, right? That is the coolest thing about the human brain, but for sure. But in doing so, I think people develop a misconception that the relationship between higher order brain function, executive function, when I'm saying executive function and higher order cognition, I mean, it's like it can come down to being as simple as like doing the hard thing, the harder thing, because you know it'll pay off more in the long run, right? So delaying gratification, making sort of complicated decisions, right? And I think that people make the mistake of assuming that that if we could only diminish the role, and I should also note that part of that executive function, part of that higher order cognition from the frontal lobes is literally to inhibit the limbic system. The limbic system is the network of brain regions that essentially is the substrate for emotion in the human brain, well, in everybody's brain.
Wait,
and one of the
can you repeat that real quick? What the purpose of what is to inhibit the limbic system?
So the prefrontal cortex is a large region of the frontal lobe. It's like right in the middle, pretty much. And like one of its main functions, I mean, quite literally, one of its main functions is to send off signals to parts of the brain that are associated with emotion, right? To inhibit those emotions. Like, okay, yes, I know this ice cream.
You're saying this is where the concept of like logic or reason versus emotion comes from, this is part of it. It's like literally like different areas in the brain.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that people develop that
because
intuitive understanding.
That,
yeah, right, exactly. But what I am, I'm sort of steel manning that argument that like, yes, that is a very important role for the frontal lobes. However, when I like to think about, rather than being something like competing systems, right, and our emotional systems and our, let's say higher order cognition, I think of them more as synergistic systems, right? And so these are systems that influence each other, and we sort of depend on both of them in different situations, right, in different moments. And so, for example, without a limbic system, right, I suspect it would be pretty difficult for a lot of humans to make the thoroughly irrational decision to reproduce, right, without having that primitive, deep-rooted love for another human and that eventual crazy attachment, right, and unique experience of love when the baby comes around, right? I think it would be hard to make the case that getting essentially zero sleep and having essentially zero spare time and your diet turning into garbage is a particularly good bargain for years, right? It's totally ridiculous. And so that's just one example, right? That, our emotional systems are crucial to some of the most, important central behaviors that humans exhibit when it comes to evolution, right? And so there's this one last quote that I'll close on, as an emotional chauvinist. I know I'm going on, but so there's a geneticist named J.B.S. Halving, right? And so he has a quote, quote, "I will gladly sacrifice my life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins." Okay, so what does that mean? So he was sort of just trying to demonstrate the math here of evolution, human evolution. And so when it comes to evolution, the fundamental goal, right, the premise is that, is to pass genetic material onto the future, right? And so, this quote, "I'll sacrifice my life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins," if you save the life of 2 siblings, and this is totally oversimplified, but you're essentially, if you save the lives of 2 siblings, who share approximately half of your genetic information, then you will have theoretically preserved the equivalent of your whole genome with the 2 siblings saved. And then similar concept to the 8 cousins, right? Each has about 12.5% of your genetic material. And so saving 8 of them would be the equivalent to a whole you. And so, to be clear, he was just doing this math to simplify the point of genetic inheritance. That's not actually how it works. But it is true that primates will pretty much follow that trend, right? They will, when it comes to aggressors and, other troops, troops of baboons, let's say, if, there's a threatening baboon, generally speaking, they will first defend their direct relatives, their siblings, and their children, obviously, and that kind of stuff. And then once they're safe, they will then next defend the baboons to whom they are most closely related, after their siblings. And so why do we react that way? It's not like any organism on earth is actively thinking like, the only reason that I would give my life to save my daughter is so that my genetic material is preserved going forward. Nobody thinks that way. It's purely emotional, right? It's purely the magnitude of that emotional experience that I have and the attachment that I have to her is so significant that nothing else is going to prevent me from behaving in this way. And we see that same kind of thing demonstrated throughout the animal kingdom. And so it is that way, right? Because it is a strategy to preserve genetic material moving forward, right? And so without the emotional system, it would be completely irrational for any organism to sacrifice their own life, right? Because, okay, game over, right? You're done. And so without the emotional system, that behavior, that very conserved behavior wouldn't exist. All right. Plus emotions, life would suck without emotions.
Yeah, and you're saying emotions are useful. Exactly. And like this, for what Ian is, to summarize what Ian is describing a little bit, like this is what's known as kin selection, basically. Like from an evolutionary standpoint, evolution is just about successfully passing on your genes. From an evolutionary standpoint, having like two kids can be the same as like having multiple cousins. It's just like, are you passing on like a proportionally high amount of your genes? And this is why in some animals, like certain species of birds, for example, there's strategies where the siblings, like some animals don't have babies, and instead they just help take care of their siblings or future generations of their siblings. And that's because from a genetic standpoint, having siblings that successfully grow up and go on to reproduce can be just as good as you having your own kids. And this has been proposed also as an explanation for why homosexuality persists in some animals. And people have explored this idea, and in people, it doesn't explain homosexuality, but like in some other animals, it does, basically. Whereas like, it's kind of a good thing for everyone if like not everyone is necessarily like having kids and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So. I mean, there's some amazing, like, again, nobody's actively nobody, I mean, I think about it, obviously, because I'm a weirdo, right? And I'm a scientist, right? And so, yeah, I do think about it in genetic terms, but nobody does, right? You're responding to emotional reactions. But what's interesting is that if you look at like let's say, okay, let's take a troop of baboons, right? Baboons are very aggressive primates, but they're also very smart, they're baboons, they're big primates. But anyways, let's say that there's a baboon that's threatening another baboon. Let's talk about male baboons, right? It doesn't have to be male. And one of the baboons knows that he or she is much weaker, right? And there's no way that this more, this stronger, bigger, probably older baboon, is just going to destroy them. And so what they will do is they will go and find the offspring that is most closely related to the aggressor, the bigger aggressor, and essentially hold it up. Like physically, they will do this, like hold up the baboon in front of the baby, in front of them, basically saying like, you got to go through your little cousin or your little nephew or whatever, your little niece, if you're going to get to me, right? And it's not like they know. Of course, they don't think in terms of like, this is my great uncle, but they intuitively know. Right. And it's through this whole sort of constellation or conspiracy of, that vomeronasal organ, right, where they can smell familiarity. You can smell, you can detect relations there, sensory systems, obviously, but then also just this emotional attachment that that they form with other members of their troop, but then also that they know that other members of the troop form. Right. And so all of that, or not all of it, but a large percentage of that behavior is driven by emotion.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, look, I realize we're getting pretty deep into like emotion, like the question of our emotions evolutionarily beneficial. But I mean, this whole thing also reminds me of how, like often you hear that intuition is some combination of the facts or your like logical side of your brain and like your feelings. And intuition has been shown to be like a really good predictor of some things. So for example, there have been studies that looked at like men who abused women. And they basically found that like if you like collect all the data you can on this guy in this relationship, nothing is a better predictor of whether he will become abusive towards a woman than the woman's intuition, basically. And so like that's supposedly incorporating like, you know, like all like the data, all the hard facts we can collect on this person, and also just like the feelings that they evoke in their partner, even at this stage, like before he's actually become abusive, like these kind of like negative feelings in conjunction with like observations of the fact give some intuition of like, ooh, I think this person is like dangerous or going to be dangerous, and like something just doesn't feel safe. And so that's possibly another good example um, of like the benefit of all of these different ways in which our brain is like taking in information and trying to convey it back to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and I think, you know, the classic example of like, you know, when I was a teenager, I hated that we were emotional, that I had emotions. I wish I could just jettison that garbage part of my consciousness because it's just irritating at that age, right? And everything is just so big deal, right? Everything's so dramatic in adolescence. It's torturous. Um, but you know, and sort of the classic example is Spock, right? Or let's say Vulcans. I guess Spock isn't necessarily 100% Vulcan. I don't know, whatever. But you know, they're sort of their classic features that they don't have emotions. You know, they're purely rational. And you know, I think that they were being a little generous regarding what a race of anthropoids, right, would look like, devoid of any emotion. Because if you think about how would our morality change, right? You know, maybe the closest analog that we have to what a human would be like without any emotional life would be a sociopathy or psychopathy, right? Where, you know, decisions that are made absent any consideration for the ramifications of others. And how do we detect those ramifications emotionally? Right? It makes us sad. It would make us grieve. We know it would make other people sad and grieve. That's why it's bad, right? You know, even if it would be objectively beneficial to you to take somebody out, you know? And so yeah, I mean, I think that, as always, science fiction is the best venue for extrapolating what, you know, any given civilization would be like. But yeah, I think that it is fortuitous that this is the mechanism that evolved on Earth as the behavioral rudder. It's not perfect, but essentially nothing in evolution ever is. And I think it's pretty good. I'm glad that I'm capable of feeling the emotions that I can feel when, you know, my daughter learns a new word, or we had like a straight up conversation the other day while she was falling asleep, which is super strange to talk to an infant, where it's more than just like a she says something, I say something. It's like a she says something, I say something. You know, it's back and forth, and it's sort of like weird, you know. But it's like this deep experience, and who would, you know, that the only reason I care about that is the emotional experience that I have. All right, I will save you all from hearing more about emotion.
Well, Ian, we definitely
So
need to
I mean,
have some more, some more like sci-fi follow-up episodes, because I always want to like go and veer off and geek out on like sci-fi stuff with you.
I'm super
Well,
down.
yeah, I'm gonna throw out one more just quick example wildlife vestigial trait thing. And I think it's an example of how I am one of those people that I'm always thinking of like the counter argument, even if I don't necessarily agree with it. And so this is just like another example of that, I guess, is like wings on flightless birds is another example that's like classic example of vestigial traits. But, you know, just the idea is like, oh, they can't fly, but they still have wings. Why would they need wings? But here's a picture of an ostrich, a flightless bird, spreading out its wings to make itself look big and defend its nest. Actually, in this picture is what it's doing. So this is like our goosebumps example with the humans. Like birds and many animals have a good reason to want to try to look big. So its wings are still doing something. Its wings are helping it look big. And also its wings can be used to if they can spread them out to help them cool off in the summer, right? So instead of just being this ball that's like conserving heat, they can just hold their wings out, and that helps like with like airflow over their body, as long as the air is cooler than their internal temperature. So it can be helpful with that too. So just like a kind of, for our closing remarks, just a quick example of vestigial trait or not vestigial trait. So many different directions you can explore with this. I'm getting distracted because Scott is talking more about sci-fi in the comments, and I'm gonna restrain myself. No more sci-fi. We've covered a lot of full vestigial examples in this. Yeah, go ahead.
Georgia, if I recall correctly, that's interesting. I'd never heard about that. That basically being a heat sink for ostriches. That's interesting. I believe I recall that.
Clear, like, I just made it up. I mean, I didn't make it up. I was just like, when I was looking at these examples, I was like, this doesn't seem right, and that's where that came from. But it makes sense, right?
Gotcha. Yeah. Absolutely. And I recall, there were all those dinosaurs that have that very large sort of dorsal fin, essentially, but they're not aquatic, right? And one of the explanations that I recall, the Spinosaurus, I think, is the one that I remember because spine, obviously. And I believe that the explanation was that it could function, since they were cold-blooded, it could function as, a way for them to radiate heat if they needed to, or catch heat if they needed to. It's kind of interesting. Okay, I have one other super short example, and then another topic that we, don't necessarily have to get into because it's a little bit kind of just for fun. But a classic example of a vestigial, well, a part of the body that again is an example of like the line being blurred. It's not like you're either vestigial or you're totally not, right? Or totally useful.
That's a really good point. Yeah, example. We were like, here's these different options, but it's not. It's also a continuous sort of between them. Yeah. What?
Right. And so yeah, another classic one that is discussed is the coccyx, right, or the tailbone. And so it's that irritating little protrusion right above the butt, right? And we call it a tailbone for a good reason. It pretty much is the stub of what used to be a tail in our primate ancestors. And, obviously some primates still rely very heavily on their tails to navigate and climb and grasp and stuff. Not so much us, right? But, because we all evolved from a shared primate ancestor that definitely had a very useful tail, a whole network of muscles are sort of anchored to the coccyx, right? So it's not necessarily entirely vestigial, but beyond basically being sort of like a boat cleat, right, where you're like sort of tying around all those muscles, on a dock, right?
I've never heard that metaphor, and I love it.
Yeah. So beyond functioning like that, it certainly isn't nearly as functionally important as it used to be, right? And it can sort of be a liability, actually, when people fall on their butts, and fracturing that thing is profoundly painful and basically debilitating, right? And it takes a long time to heal, so like having it is not necessarily super great, but it's also not entirely vestigial. So the coccyx, that'll be my closing one. The last topic I was going to go into is spandrels, but the reality is it's not really directly related, and it's more just sort of like a fun thing to look into. So I would suggest anybody that's interested in the relationship between architecture and human evolution, look into the word spandrel. Here, I'll type it here.
I love it. We should close with that, because we're talking about this in like a biology evolutionary context, but the truth is that things being left over or repurposed in weird ways is not something that's limited to biology and evolution. So tell us about spandrels, Ian.
Okay, so here we go. So spandrels, the concept, it is an architectural term. So, while I think a lot of people are familiar with the concept of a vestigial organ, I don't think as many are familiar with the concept of a spandrel in evolution. And so a spandrel is a beautiful term, in my opinion, that and concept that Steve A. Gould and Richard Lewontin devised to sort of describe traits that are basically incidental, right? They have no actual functional benefit. They're just byproducts of another trait, right? So for example, human blood is red, right? And it's red because of the specific molecules that compose our blood. It's not red because it's like super helpful to have red blood, right? And so the term spandrel is derived from architecture, as I was saying, and it's just sort of like a triangular gap in the corners of arches that are there just because arches are being used, right? You cannot have a structure built the way that these structures are built with arches without that little triangular corner, the spandrel. And they're often very ornate, like this beautiful one from the Basilica di San Marco in Venice. But as Gould and Lewontin would describe, they're not really important structures, right? They're only there because arches
on their own, they're not like super functional. Yeah, it's not like this little triangle is here for this reason. It's incidental to having a circular arch, like you said, in like a square structure. Yeah.
Yeah, and so an example of that's generally brought up in discussion of human spandrels is the human chin, and so humans are the only primates with chins. Well, chins designed the way that they are, right? Which is kind of strange, right, when you think about it. And so as our face was shortening, our head was shortening, and our posture straightened, to be more bipedal and make all this room for our big old fancy brains up here, our mouths started to diminish in size. Right. And so the lower jaw then began protruding out a bit, just purely because of geometry, right? Making more space for our airways, which were becoming more and more important for communication, obviously. And so, it's not like it's super useful to have a chin. It's there because of the evolution of other traits. That's the argument that a spandrel advocate would make. But the whole concept of spandrels is actually somewhat contentious. Some scientists argue that these various traits actually do have biological functionality, but it's just not exactly obvious what those purposes are. And so Daniel Dennett is a neurophilosopher. He's probably the most prominent critic of spandrels. So Dennett argues that you might even recognize him if you saw him, if you ever, I don't know, look at neuroscience talks. He looks kind of like Darwin himself, but he argues that just because a trait has a very subtle function, as subtle as just being purely sexually attractive, right? Then that's its function. And so to suggest that it's completely incidental, has no point of being there, to argue that that's the case is sort of missing on some very subtle aspects of evolution. I don't really know where I stand on that. I don't really stand in either camp. I just love the concept. I think it's beautiful. And I think you could make the same argument with this wonderful spandrel that we're looking at here, right? You could accomplish the goal of what a spandrel is doing with other structural features, right? I can't remember what they're called, but they're just basically other ways to reinforce up. But they have this spandrel. They have this venue for beautiful art, and of course, part of all these cathedrals and stuff was they were worship. They were structures of worship, and part of that worship was demonstrating all this beauty, through all this sculpture and art and stuff like that. And so inevitably that surface is going to be covered with beautiful art. And what's its purpose? Its purpose is to be beautiful. And so that would be the counter argument to the spandrel argument. But anyway, this is one of my favorites.
Yeah, it's still contributing something because now it's like this extra surface that can be decorated in something. And so
exactly.
It's not completely neutral after all.
So
I think this is
the
really
line blurs.
Yeah. Well, and this is really interesting because we've gotten into why it's so hard to say whether or not something's vestigial. Because a lot of things in evolution aren't necessarily like useful, even if they never had a purpose. Like in the example of vestigial traits, we're talking about things usually that were definitely useful and now are not useful, yes. We think. But there are all kinds of things in evolution that are maybe not useful and also maybe never really had a strong purpose either, a strong adaptive purpose. So this is we're kind of like in some weird Venn diagram now where we're touching on like lots of different things in evolution, not just vestigial traits. But I think it's a great place. I think it's a great place to close off. And thank you to everybody for showing up in the comments. Everyone in the comments is talking about Foundation and Dune sci-fi adaptations now.
Super psyched. Yeah, they both look awesome. And I just wanted to, so in case anybody is unfamiliar, I'm sure everybody here is familiar, but there are two other scientists, or at least have been with us. So there's Deanna C. Hooper. She's a cosmologist, studies dark matter I don't know if she's moved yet.
She has. But, I know this from reading the comments earlier.
Oh, awesome. Okay, well, congratulations, Deanna. So yeah, you should check out her stuff. She's pretty active on HAPS on the platform. And then Christian Zasa is here too. He's probably the most accomplished or talented photographer, national photographer I've ever met. And he just has some really beautiful content, right? For a feast for the eyes. So check out Christian Zasa and Deanna C. Hooper. And I just wanted to thank you, Georgia, for allowing me to join you and talk about some of these quirky little parts of human evolution. I appreciate it.
Oh, of course. And, I'm thinking now, like Christian and I do a show like every Wednesday at like 1 Pacific time, 4 East Coast time, but it's on humans and wildlife. And this episode actually ended up like integrating like humans and wildlife and what like animals can teach us about ourselves more. So I'm kind of regretting that like we didn't have you as a guest on that show, but it was fun to talk to you one-on-one as well. But yeah, definitely check out Deanna and Christian. And thank you everyone in the comments for showing up and taking part in the discussion. It was really great to hear all of your input and everything. And yeah, thank you, Ian, for coming on the show. I learned a lot. I always learn a lot from listening to you, and I always appreciate how deep into detail you go on every
It's
one
my
of your
pleasure,
episodes.
and likewise,
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
All right, thank you, everybody.